It began on a quiet spring morning beside Silverpine Lake, where the air still carried the cool breath of dawn and the surface of the water looked like polished glass. The pines stood tall and unmoving, their needles whispering softly in the wind as the sun broke gently over the horizon. The man who owned that little stretch of land, David Turner, had always said this place was the only corner of the world that felt truly alive to him. He had built his cabin here by hand years ago, plank by plank, stone by stone, guided by nothing but the sound of the forest and the rhythm of his own heart. The cabin wasn't large or fancy, it was simple, made of pine logs cut from the same woods that surrounded it. It had a stone fireplace in the center, a porch that faced the sunrise, and a small dock stretching out into the still lake where he would sometimes sit for hours just listening to the water lap against the shore. It wasn't just a building, it was a piece of his soul, the only place he could breathe without the noise of the world pressing in. When he drove up that morning, he expected to hear the quiet buzz of cicadas, the wind in the trees, and maybe the creak of his porch steps under his boots. But instead, there was nothing, no birds, no forest sounds, no hum of life. Just an unnatural emptiness that made his chest tighten. The moment he turned the corner of the dirt road and caught sight of his property, his breath left him. The cabin, his cabin, was gone. Not damaged, not vandalized, but completely erased from the earth. The ground where it had stood was leveled, the soil churned up by heavy machinery. Splintered wood and broken bricks lay scattered across the clearing like bones. The chimney, the dock, the fire pit, all gone. The only thing left standing was a white sign planted in the dirt, its words painted in bold black letters, HOA property, unauthorized structure removed. For a moment, he couldn't move. He just sat in his truck, staring through the windshield, his heart pounding against his ribs. It didn't make sense. His land wasn't part of the HOA. He had checked the boundaries himself when he bought it. He had the deed, the surveys, the maps, all legal, all approved. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, his boots crunching over the gravel as he walked forward. The air smelled faintly of diesel and sawdust, and the sound of distant machinery carried from somewhere behind the tree line. He followed it, rounding a corner, and there they were, two large HOA trucks parked by the road, their backs loaded with debris. Men in reflective vests were tossing pieces of what used to be his life into the back like junk. "Hey!" David shouted, his voice breaking the still air. The men turned, startled. One of them, a stocky man with a sunburned face, wiped his hands on his vest and frowned. "Can I help you?" he asked, as if this were just another routine cleanup. David took a slow step forward. "You can start by telling me why you're tearing down my home." The man blinked, confused. "Your home? You mean that cabin?" David's voice hardened. "Yes, the cabin that was standing right here." The man glanced at his clipboard. "Look, sir, we're just following orders. The HOA board said it was an unapproved structure built within community limits. They told us to remove it." David stared at him for a long moment. "Community limits?" he repeated slowly. "This land isn't part of your community." The man shrugged. "You'll have to take that up with the board. We just do what we're told." The words hit him like cold water. They just do what they're told. The same excuse he'd heard 100 times in his career from people who thought they could hide behind policy. But this wasn't paperwork. This was his home. He looked past the worker toward the trucks, his eyes falling on something that made his stomach twist. There, stacked in the corner of one truck, were the remains of his grandfather's chair, the old oak rocker he'd inherited and restored. Its arm was snapped clean in half. Next to it, the pieces of his dock, the boards warped and splintered. The sight sent a dull ache through his chest, not from rage, but from the quiet, hollow weight of disbelief. He turned back to the foreman and spoke softly, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You have no idea what you've done." The man frowned but said nothing. David stepped back, his mind already racing. He knew yelling wouldn't change anything. The men weren't the problem. They were tools, used by people who thought power meant permission. He walked back to his truck in silence, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the driver's seat, he stopped and looked over the lake. The sunlight had climbed higher, catching the surface of the water and scattering it into 1,000 shards of gold. It was beautiful, but all he could see was loss. He sat there for a long time, trying to steady his breathing. Then slowly, the stillness around him began to shift, and beneath the hurt, something else began to stir. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter, colder. He had spent his life building things, inspecting blueprints, approving foundations, making sure every wall that went up in the county met the standard of safety and integrity. He knew every law, every code, every loophole. And now, those same laws would be the blade he used to cut through the people who thought they could break them. He had always believed in justice done by the book, but today, the book was his weapon. He started the engine and drove toward town, the dirt road kicking up clouds behind him. As the forest thinned and the houses of Silver Pine Estates came into view, he saw the problem more clearly. The HOA had expanded their reach over the years, buying up land around the lake, redrawing their own borders without real legal approval. They had convinced residents that they owned everything within a certain radius of the water. Everything, apparently, except David's silence. He passed through the polished iron gates of the community and saw the signs everywhere, Silver Pine HOA, a place to belong. It made him almost laugh. They had built their empire on control, on fear of paperwork and fines. But what they didn't realize was that the one man they shouldn't have crossed was the very person who decided what was legal in this entire county. When he pulled into town, he didn't go home. He went straight to the county office. The receptionist smiled politely when she saw him. "Morning, Mr. Turner. You're in early." David smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Mind if I use the records room?" She nodded and handed him the key. He walked down the hall to the heavy door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The air smelled of paper and ink, and the rows of filing cabinets stretched endlessly under the dim light. He pulled out the property maps, the boundary surveys, the HOA registration forms. Within minutes, he found what he needed, the Silver Pine HOA development plans. He spread them across the table and scanned every inch. His eyes hardened as he found the forged signatures, the missing seals, the illegal expansions marked in red pen. The HOA had never been given permission to touch the lakeshore north of Marker 42, the exact location of his land. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "Got you," he whispered. He took photos of everything, every page, every signature, every floor. Then he closed the folder, placed it back neatly, and walked out as calmly as he had come. Outside, the sun was high now, the air warm, the town alive with people who had no idea what storm was quietly forming beneath their feet. He drove back toward the lake that afternoon, the reflection of the clouds rippling over the water. The trucks were gone now, but the empty ground where his cabin had stood felt even quieter than before. He stepped out, looked at the sign still standing there, and reached down to pull it out of the dirt. He turned it over once in his hands, reading the cheap print, the Arrogance stamped into its surface. Then he snapped it clean in half and tossed it aside. He walked down to the water's edge, crouched, and let his fingers touch the surface of the lake. The cold shocked him awake. He looked across the water at the line of houses shining under the afternoon sun. HOA houses, built under the same corruption that had stolen his cabin. Each one a structure he had once approved, unaware that one day he'd be inspecting them for something far worse than safety violations. The wind shifted, rustling through the trees, and a single leaf drifted down to land beside him on the water. He watched it float away, carried by the current, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he smiled, not out of joy, but out of certainty. He knew what he had to do. He would rebuild, yes, but not before he rebuilt the truth. And when it was done, the people who had ordered this destruction would finally understand what it meant to face a man who didn't need permission to make things right. That night, the lake fell silent again. The stars burned bright above the water, and in that stillness, David Turner sat by the ashes of what had once been his home. The forest whispered around him, the wind carrying the faint echo of his promise. He didn't need to raise his voice or call anyone out. He didn't need to threaten. All he said, quietly, almost to the trees, was, You tore it down without asking. Now I'll rebuild everything you took, starting with your rules. And as the moonlight spread across the empty clearing, the outline of the future began to take shape in his mind, not made of wood and nails this time, but of paperwork, codes, and justice that would cut sharper than any saw they had ever used. That night, the moon hung low over Silverpine Lake, its reflection trembling in the ripples of the water as a cold wind swept through the trees, whispering against the ruins of what used to be David Turner's cabin. He sat in the driver's seat of his truck, parked at the edge of the empty lot, staring at the remains of his life. The headlights illuminated the flattened earth, the twisted metal pipes, the shattered pieces of his porch railings. His chest felt tight, but his face was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that doesn't come from peace, but from pressure that has moved far beyond anger. He didn't scream, didn't curse, didn't cry. He just watched the slow dance of dust in the beam of his headlights and whispered under his breath, "You'll wish you'd never touched it." He had seen arrogance before. Years of working as a county building inspector had introduced him to every kind of bureaucratic pride, every greedy hand that thought rules didn't apply to them. But this was personal. They hadn't just broken the law. They had taken something sacred. They had torn down his home, not knowing that the man they wronged was the one who wrote the rules they had just violated. He stepped out of the truck and walked to the edge of the property, his boots crunching over crushed stone and splintered wood. The air smelled of oil, wet earth, and sawdust. He crouched down, picked up a bent nail, and rolled it between his fingers, staring at it under the silver light. "They think this is finished," he muttered quietly. "It's not even started." He stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and walked toward the lake. The reflection of the moon rippled on the surface, calm and unbothered, as if the world hadn't changed. He could see his face in that reflection, eyes hard, jaw tight, the stillness of a man planning, calculating, waiting. For the first time since the demolition, a faint smile touched his lips, cold and thin. When he finally left, he didn't go home. He drove straight to the county office, the one where he'd worked for over 20 years, the one where every blueprint, every permit, every law passed through his hands before a single nail was ever driven into wood. He knew the security guard on the night shift, an old friend named Raymond who just nodded as David walked past. "Late night again. Hey, Turner," Raymond said with a chuckle. David gave a faint smile. "You know me," he replied. "Paperwork never ends." He walked down the empty hallway, the sound of his boots echoing softly against the tile floor. The building was dark except for the flickering fluorescent lights near the back. He entered his office, flicked on the small desk lamp, and sat down at his computer. The glow of the screen illuminated his face as he began typing, slowly, deliberately. First, he opened the county mapping database, a system he knew better than anyone. Then he pulled up the parcel file for Silverpine Estates Homeowners Association. He scrolled through their listed properties, checking boundary coordinates, zoning permits, and construction approvals. His fingers moved steadily, his expression unreadable. After 20 minutes, he stopped. His cursor hovered over something that made his pulse quicken. The HOA had listed expansions into lakeside buffer zones, claiming jurisdiction over parcels that clearly fell outside their registered land. One of those parcels was his. He opened the original deed for his property, Lot 19B, Silverpine Lakefront, and compared it to the HOA's claim. The difference was exact. His property had been forcibly absorbed into their map. They'd used outdated county overlays, intentionally filed under old zoning codes that no longer existed, to claim land that was never theirs. It was the kind of fraud most inspectors wouldn't notice. But David was not most inspectors. He leaned back in his chair, the faint creak of the leather filling the silence. "So that's how you did it," he said under his breath. "You drew a new line on a map and thought that made it real." He pulled out his phone and began taking photos of the documents on the screen. One by one, page after page, every falsified coordinate, every signature, every approval stamp that didn't belong to any current official. He even recognized one of the names, Charles Benton, a man who had retired 10 years ago but whose signature appeared on permits dated just 6 months earlier. That alone was enough to start an audit, and David intended to make sure the audit would end with the HOA stripped to its bones. He printed copies of the files, neatly labeled them, and slipped them into a manila folder marked HOA Records, Unauthorized Zoning. Then he opened another folder from his desk drawer, a personal one, older, worn at the edges. Inside were the original architectural plans for his cabin, stamped with full county approval under his own name. His cabin had been inspected, cleared, and built legally, by the same office that had now unknowingly allowed its destruction. He smiled faintly. Perfect, he whispered. The irony wasn't lost on him. The HOA had demolished the property of the one man whose paperwork they could never twist or manipulate. By dawn, he was still there, sitting in the same chair as the sun broke through the blinds. The first rays of morning painted the papers on his desk gold, and for a moment, he felt the same calm he used to feel sitting on the porch of his cabin, watching the sunrise over the lake. Except this time, the calm wasn't peace, it was precision. Everything was set in motion. He shut down the computer, gathered the folders, and slipped them into his briefcase. As he locked his office door, Raymond called out again from the front desk, sipping his coffee. "Hey Turner, you heading home?" David paused, smiled faintly. "Soon," he said. "Just a few things to clean up first." By mid-morning, he drove back towards Silver Pine Estates, not to confront anyone, but to watch. He parked his truck near the entrance, behind a line of tall pines, and studied the houses. They were perfect, too perfect, white fences, manicured lawns, new decks and sheds that, to the untrained eye, looked harmless. But to him, they screamed violations. Illegal modifications, unpermitted expansions, non-compliant drainage systems. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. He pulled out a small notebook and began jotting down addresses, small observations, violations he could cite without ever stepping foot on their land. Every note was another match, and soon, he would have enough to light a fire they couldn't control. Around noon, a white SUV pulled up near the community office. He recognized the woman who stepped out immediately, Karen Bixley, HOA president, and self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood standards. She was the kind of woman who spoke in rules, who smiled only when enforcing them. David watched her greet two board members, her voice sharp and commanding. "That unauthorized structure on the lakefront? Gone. Completely handled," she said proudly. "It's about time we cleaned up that eyesore." The men laughed, nodding in agreement. "We'll file the paperwork after lunch," one said. "Don't bother," Karen replied smugly. "No one's going to contest it. Whoever owned it clearly didn't belong here." David closed his notebook slowly, his eyes cold. "Didn't belong here," he repeated softly, the words settling deep in his chest. He started his engine and drove away before anyone saw him, the sound of gravel crunching under his tires. There was no point confronting them now. They would know soon enough, when every inspection, every code, every rule they thought they understood came crashing down on them. That night, he sat by the edge of the lake once more, a lantern by his side, the reflection of the moon dancing on the water. He flipped open his notebook again and began to outline his plan. First, he would schedule random inspections of every HOA property, one by one. Then, he would cross-check their permits, flag every false filing, every missing signature, every unapproved addition. He knew that once the violations reached the county board, the fines alone would bankrupt them. The best part was that he didn't need revenge in the traditional sense. No yelling, no confrontation. His silence was already the weapon. He stayed there until the lantern burned low, his shadow stretching long across the ground. The lake was calm, the world still, and David Turner sat there like a man who had found his purpose again. The HOA thought they'd erased him, buried him under their arrogance. But in truth, they had just awakened the one man who could dismantle them completely, and he would do it legally, line by line, law by law, until the same system they had abused turned against them like a blade in the dark. The next morning, sunlight crept slowly over the quiet town of Silver Pine, spilling gold over rooftops and waking the lake with a soft shimmer. But David Turner had been awake long before dawn. Sitting at his kitchen table surrounded by papers, permits, maps, and coffee that had gone cold hours ago. His hands moved steadily as he sifted through one document after another, every detail drawing a clearer picture of the rot hiding beneath the HOA's perfect surface. The more he read, the more disgusted he felt. What had once been a homeowners association meant to maintain order had become a private empire built on intimidation and deception. They issued fines without cause, expanded boundaries without authority, and demolished homes that didn't fit their image of control. But the mistake they made this time was simple and irreversible. They targeted the one man who had the power to expose them legally, thoroughly, and publicly. He leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth curling slightly. This wasn't anger anymore. This was precision disguised as patience. By mid-morning, David walked into the county office like it was any ordinary day. He nodded to the receptionist, exchanged small talk with a few co-workers, and went straight to his desk. He didn't want anyone to suspect what he was doing. Not yet. He turned on his computer, opened the public project files, and began combing through every active construction project tied to the Silver Pine HOA. It didn't take long before red flags began flashing on the screen. Missing inspection reports. Outdated safety evaluations. Buildings listed as approved with no record of site visits. His cursor hovered over one particular entry, a lakeside pool renovation project. The file claimed it had been signed off 6 months ago by a man named Charles Benton, the same inspector whose retirement party David had attended over a decade ago. The HOA had forged not just one document but entire approval chains under names of officials who no longer worked there. It was fraud, layered and deliberate. He clicked print and watched the evidence roll out of the printer in thick sheets. By noon, his desk was covered in papers. He cross-checked every permit they'd filed for the past 3 years. The HOA had built a community office without fire clearance, expanded their parking lot without environmental approval, and added several new cabins around the lake in violation of shoreline regulations. It wasn't carelessness. It was greed disguised as authority. He organized the papers into labeled folders: illegal construction, forged permits, boundary violations, demolition orders. When the last folder was sealed, he stared at the stack for a long moment. It was more than enough to bury them in legal hell for years. But that wasn't what he wanted yet. He didn't want punishment handed down quietly through paperwork. He wanted them to feel the collapse. That evening, when most employees had gone home, David stayed behind in the office, the only light coming from his desk lamp and the faint glow of the computer monitor. He logged into the county's inspection scheduling system and began creating requests, anonymous, official, and impossible to trace. Each one flagged a different HOA project for reinspection. Routine compliance audit, he typed into the notes, his fingers steady and sure. By the time he was done, 7 separate notices had been generated, all of them set to arrive at the HOA office first thing Monday morning. The county trucks would roll in without warning. The inspectors would ask questions the board couldn't answer, and their web of forged paperwork would start to unravel. It wasn't vengeance. It was accountability dressed in silence. The next few days unfolded like clockwork. Monday morning, the HOA office buzzed with confusion. Residents had received letters stating that multiple community structures were being investigated for zoning and safety violations. "What's this about?" one resident shouted at the front desk. "We already passed inspection." The secretary looked pale, flipping through her files, her hands trembling as she realized none of their supposed approvals had any real signatures. At the same time, county vehicles began arriving at the lakefront, inspectors stepping out in uniform, clipboards in hand. They examined sidewalks, measured property lines, and took photographs of structures that weren't supposed to exist. David didn't go with them. He watched from across the lake through binoculars, sitting quietly in his parked truck as if it were just another morning by the water. From his distance, he could see Karen Bixley storming out of the HOA office, waving papers in the air, shouting at the inspectors. Her voice carried faintly across the water. "This is a mistake. Everything was approved." But even from here, David could tell the officials weren't convinced. They pointed to their forms, shook their heads, and began taping yellow under investigation notices to several properties. The board members followed her out, whispering nervously. Some tried to talk to the inspectors, but the law didn't bend to charm or anger. It bent to proof, and David had made sure proof was the only thing left. That night, the community's private online forum exploded with panic. Homeowners were demanding answers. Why is my garage flagged for inspection? Who said my deck violates code? Why are there county trucks here every day? Karen tried to calm them with carefully worded posts, claiming it was a routine check and nothing to worry about. But beneath her confidence, David could sense the cracks forming. He stayed up late reading the threads anonymously, watching fear replace arrogance. It was like watching a house of cards begin to tremble before it fell. On Wednesday morning, he took it one step further. He requested an emergency audit of the HOA's financial records through an internal review order, something only his office had the authority to do. It was signed under his name, sealed, and filed officially. The order meant that within 72 hours, the HOA would be forced to hand over every receipt, every transaction, and every expense tied to development. David didn't even need to accuse them of wrongdoing. Their own paperwork would do that for him. Later that afternoon, as he drove back toward the lake, the roads were busy with construction workers leaving early. Their jobs had been frozen under investigation. The once busy HOA office now looked lifeless, its windows dark, the sign on the door barely swinging in the wind. The silence felt heavier than before. He parked his truck at the same spot where his cabin once stood and stepped out, the wind catching his jacket. The lake shimmered in the fading light, calm and unbothered, but behind that still beauty, the storm he had started was spreading like fire. He crouched near the water, touched the surface again, and watched the ripples spread outward, one after another. "You started this," he whispered softly, "but I'll be the one who finishes it." By nightfall, he returned to his home office, pulled out his files again, and began assembling everything into one master binder labeled Silverpine HOA, case materials. He flipped through the pages slowly, his eyes tracing each signature, each date, each line of proof that connected back to the people who had thought they could erase him. Every word, every photo, every forged stamp was a nail in the coffin of their empire. And yet, he didn't feel joy. What he felt was focus, a deep, consuming determination to restore what was right. Outside, the rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, tapping against the window like a drumbeat. The lake would be rising by morning, the sound carrying across the forest, just like the whispers that were already spreading through the town. The HOA's name had become a rumor, a warning, a story told in grocery stores and coffee shops about how Arrogance had finally met its reckoning. And as David turned off his lamp, leaving only the sound of rain in the dark, one thought stayed clear in his mind. They had taken his cabin, his peace, his sanctuary, but he had taken something far more permanent from them, their illusion of control. The following Thursday, the HOA boardroom buzzed like a beehive struck by a stick, voices rising and falling in panic as papers shuffled, phones rang, and worried residents crowded near the door demanding answers. The room smelled of burnt coffee and desperation. At the head of the long table sat Karen Bixley, the woman who once carried herself like a queen presiding over her little suburban kingdom. But now, the confidence that had once laced her voice was gone, replaced with a thin thread of exhaustion. Her blonde hair was tied too tight, her lipstick smeared from biting her lip, and her sharp blue eyes darted from one report to another as if trying to find a way out of a burning building. "Everyone calm down," she barked, slamming her palm on the table. "These inspections are temporary. Routine. We've handled this before." Her tone tried to sound sure, but it cracked like old wood under pressure. Across from her, the HOA's vice president, Tom Willis, a nervous man with a perpetually red face, shuffled through his papers. "Karen, these aren't routine," he muttered. "They're auditing every one of our projects. Pool, community center, even the damn mailboxes. Half the residents have stop work orders on their homes." He threw a letter down on the table. The bold stamp under investigation stared up at everyone like a death mark. Karen shot him a glare. "It's an overreaction," she said. "We've got the right paperwork." "Do we?" he snapped back. The room fell quiet. The treasurer, a round woman named Denise, cleared her throat. I checked the files, she said hesitantly. Some of the permits, they're missing stamps. And one of the inspectors listed on them retired 10 years ago. Karen's face went pale. That's impossible. Denise looked down. It's not. I called the county office to confirm, and they said the signature doesn't match. The air in the room shifted, heavy and suffocating. Karen forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. All right, she said through gritted teeth. We'll fix it. We'll call the county and clear this up. She stood, grabbed her phone, and stepped out into the hallway. But her hands were shaking so badly she could barely type. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Karen dialed the county office, forcing her voice to sound composed when the line connected. Yes, this is Karen Bixley from the Silver Pine Homeowners Association, she said briskly. I need to speak to whoever's in charge of these inspection orders. The receptionist on the other end hesitated. These are official compliance audits issued under the county's development division. They can't be cancelled or postponed. Karen's stomach sank. Well, who authorized them? She demanded. The line clicked as the woman checked the record. When she spoke again, her tone had changed, more cautious, almost nervous. The orders were signed by Chief Inspector David Turner. For a long moment, Karen couldn't breathe. The name echoed in her head like a gunshot. David Turner. The same man whose cabin they had demolished. The same man she had dismissed as a nuisance, a nobody. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles whitening. That can't be right, she whispered. But even as she said it, the truth hit her like cold water. She ended the call, her throat dry, and stared at the empty hallway, the realization spreading through her like fire. The man she had mocked, the man she had called a rule breaker in front of her board, was the one now dismantling her entire empire. Legally, quietly, and with her own rules. She walked back into the meeting room, her face pale but composed, and tried to speak as if nothing had happened. I've confirmed with the county, she said, forcing her voice to stay level. They're just verifying some old records. Tom frowned. Who ordered it? Karen paused for half a second too long. It doesn't matter. But Denise caught the flicker in her eyes. It was him, wasn't it? She said softly. Karen's head jerked toward her. What are you talking about? The man with the cabin, Denise said, her voice trembling. The one we tore down last month. He's the inspector. The room erupted in a flurry of whispers. Tom slammed his hand on the table. You told us that property was under HOA jurisdiction, he shouted. You said we had the right to clear it. Karen's voice rose, desperate now. We did. The maps you drew yourself, Tom interrupted bitterly. You forged the lines, Karen. Watch your tone, she snapped, but the command no longer carried any power. The other board members sat frozen, realizing the full extent of what they had done. Meanwhile, across town, David sat in his office, calm as a lake at dawn, watching as his plan unfolded exactly as he had envisioned. His inbox filled with inspection updates and progress reports. Violations confirmed. Fines pending. Construction halted. The HOA was drowning in red tape, and every email that came in felt like another step toward justice. He leaned back in his chair and looked out the window, the afternoon sunlight catching the framed photo of his old cabin on the wall. He smiled faintly, not with joy, but with quiet satisfaction. They were unraveling themselves. He didn't need to lift a finger now. Gravity was doing the work. Back in the boardroom, Karen's phone buzzed again. Another email. Her hands shook as she opened it. The subject line read, Notice of County Review, pending public hearing. She scanned the message, and her heart dropped to the floor. The county wasn't just auditing. They were calling for a formal review, one that would include a public hearing with full attendance. We're done, Tom muttered, sinking back into his chair. We're absolutely done. Karen tried to steady her voice. No, we're not. I'll handle this. I'll talk to Turner personally. The room fell silent. Denise looked horrified. You can't, she whispered. He's not someone you can threaten anymore. Karen glared at her, but she knew the woman was right. Still, she couldn't just sit and wait. She grabbed her bag and stormed out, the door slamming behind her, leaving the board in stunned silence. Outside, she climbed into her SUV, her heart pounding, her mind spinning through every memory of the man she had insulted, the man whose home she had destroyed without hesitation. She remembered the way he had looked at her that day. Quiet, calm, no shouting, no anger. Just those steady eyes that had said everything without a word. You have no idea what you've done. She gripped the steering wheel, her nails digging into the leather. You think you can destroy me with paperwork? She hissed under her breath. We'll see. But while Karen plotted her next move, the damage had already spread too far. The residents of Silver Pine Estates had begun turning on her. By evening, social media was ablaze with posts from homeowners furious over the sudden inspections, fines, and property freezes. HOA lied about approvals. Our fees are being wasted on legal battles. We want the board out. The rebellion that Karen had always feared was finally here, and it wasn't being fought with picket signs. It was being fought with her own paperwork. As night fell, she sat alone in the dark office, the glow of her computer screen casting harsh light across her face. She opened her email one more time, scrolling through the endless flood of notices, violations, and complaints, until one new message stood out at the top of her inbox. It was short, no sender listed, no subject line. She clicked it open, and there was only one sentence inside: You took my home. Now I'm taking yours, one inspection at a time. Her breath caught. No name, no signature. But she didn't need either. She knew exactly who it was from. Across the lake, in the same spot where his cabin once stood, David stood under the starlight, the wind rippling across the dark water. In the distance, he could see the faint lights of the HOA's office glowing through the trees. He smiled quietly, his hands in his coat pockets, and whispered to himself, Now you know what it feels like to lose something you thought you controlled. The forest around him was silent except for the sound of the wind through the pines, a sound that once meant peace, but tonight, it sounded like justice finally stirring after a long sleep. Morning broke gray and heavy over Silver Pine Estates, the kind of morning that carried tension in the air, a stillness that made even the birds go quiet. The HOA office sat like a wounded fortress, its glass doors smudged with handprints from the chaos of the previous night. Papers scattered across desks, coffee cups tipped over, laptops open but abandoned. Karen Bixley arrived early, her sunglasses hiding the dark circles under her eyes, her fingers clutching a folder of desperate notes she'd scribbled between 2 sleepless nights. The parking lot was half empty, and the air carried that strange emptiness of something about to end. She pushed through the door, heels echoing down the hall, and stopped dead in her tracks. On the notice board outside the meeting room hung a large red document stamped with the county seal. Notice of public hearing, allegations of forgery, unlawful demolition, and violation of zoning regulations, Silver Pine HOA. She pulled it down with shaking hands and read every word, her chest tightening. The hearing was scheduled for tomorrow morning. Her empire had one day left to breathe. Inside, Tom Willis sat slumped at the table, staring blankly at his coffee. Denise was on the phone again, trying to calm yet another angry homeowner demanding refunds for illegal assessment fees. When Karen entered, they both looked up with faces drained of energy. What now? Tom asked quietly. Karen dropped the letter on the table with a soft thud. Tomorrow, she said. We're being dragged in tomorrow. Denise let out a weak laugh that sounded almost like a sob. Dragged in? Karen, we're finished. The inspectors froze our accounts this morning. We can't even pay the lawyers. Karen ignored her and began pacing, her mind spinning faster than her words could form. We'll fight it. We'll argue jurisdiction. They can't pin all this on us. Tom's voice was hoarse when he replied, They can. We tore down private property without permission. That man, Turner, he's got every document, every signature. He's not just filing complaints anymore. He's burying us under proof. Karen spun on him, her voice sharp. Then we make him back down. Tom stared at her like she'd gone mad. How? She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. We find something on him. Everyone has secrets. But even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction. Across the lake, in a quiet office with no windows open and a single cup of black coffee steaming on the desk, David Turner reviewed the last of his reports. His face was calm, his movements precise, like a man closing the final page of a long story. The HOA had spent years twisting county codes to suit their will, intimidating homeowners into compliance, charging thousands in unlawful fines, and now, every thread of that corruption was laid bare in front of him. He signed his name on the final inspection order, sealing the case, and leaned back in his chair. Outside his window, the light rain painted streaks on the glass, blurring the view of the courthouse across the street. Tomorrow, he would walk through those doors not as a victim, but as the man who brought an empire to its knees without raising his voice once. Back in Silver Pine, word spread like wildfire. Homeowners who had once bowed to Karen's rules were now storming the office demanding answers. By afternoon, the small parking lot was full of shouting residents waving copies of the county notices. You said our upgrades were approved. You charged us for permits that don't exist. My deck's being torn down because of you. The noise grew louder until Karen stepped outside to face them, her posture still proud but her voice brittle. Everyone, please. This is a misunderstanding. The county is reviewing old records, that's all. But no one listened. The crowd surged closer, voices rising in anger. We trusted you, someone yelled. You lied, another shouted. Tom came out to help but stopped when he saw the fury in their faces. Denise stood frozen by the door, tears filling her eyes. For years, they had ruled through fear. Now fear had turned on them. By sunset, the sheriff's deputy arrived to restore order, but the damage was already done. Residents tore down the HOA banners from the entrance, ripped the rules and regulations signs from their posts, and left them scattered on the road like fallen flags. Karen stood by her office window watching it all, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. They'll calm down, she whispered to herself, but deep down she knew they wouldn't. They had tasted freedom, the one thing she'd spent her life controlling. That night, as the neighborhood lights flickered out one by one, Karen stayed in the office, her laptop open to the county portal. She read every file again, every violation notice, every piece of evidence David had submitted. It was flawless, meticulous. He hadn't just beaten her, he'd dismantled her entire system. There were photos of the demolished cabin, maps showing the stolen boundary lines, receipts for every illegal transaction. She couldn't even deny it. Every lie she'd told was signed in her own handwriting. For the first time, the weight of what she'd done hit her fully. She leaned back in her chair, covering her face with both hands as the silence of her empty office pressed in. Meanwhile, David sat in his living room with the lake wind blowing softly through the open window. The smell of rain and pine drifted in, carrying faint echoes of frogs croaking by the water. He took a sip of his coffee and looked at the framed deed on his wall, the same deed that proved ownership of the land where his cabin once stood. It was more than a piece of paper now. It was justice made tangible. The sound of his phone buzzing broke the stillness. It was an unknown number. He let it ring twice before answering. Turner, he said calmly. For a moment, there was silence, and then a trembling voice came through the line. David, it's Karen. Her tone was nothing like the commanding woman he remembered. It was small, strained. I didn't know who you were, she whispered. If I had, I never would have. You didn't need to know who I was, he interrupted softly. You just needed to know what was right. She was quiet for a long time before saying, You're destroying everything we built. David's reply was steady, almost gentle. No, you destroyed it yourself. I'm just cleaning up the mess. She said nothing more. The line went dead. The next morning came cold and gray again, a thin fog rolling over the lake as the sun struggled to rise. The courthouse parking lot filled quickly with reporters, residents, and county officials. Cameras clicked, microphones glowed, and murmurs filled the air as the hearing began. Inside, the board members sat at the defendant's table, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. At the front of the room, David stood beside the county attorney, expression composed, a thick folder in his hands. The judge entered, her voice echoing through the room as she called the case, County of Silverpine versus Silverpine Homeowners Association. The words felt heavy, final. Karen's eyes flicked toward David, and in that instant, she knew there was no escaping it. The proceedings moved swiftly. Every piece of evidence David had gathered appeared on the screen. Photos, documents, inspection logs, even audio recordings from residents who had been threatened or fined unjustly. The courtroom gasped when the forged permits were displayed, bearing the names of dead inspectors and false signatures. Karen tried to speak, but every attempt to defend herself only made things worse. The judge's expression hardened as she read the list of violations. Illegal demolition of private property. Forgery of county documents. Misappropriation of community funds. Failure to comply with environmental regulations. Each word was a nail in the coffin. By the end, there was nothing left to say. The verdict came down swift and merciless. The HOA was to be dissolved, its assets seized, its board members personally fined and barred from holding office in the county again. When the gavel struck, the sound echoed through the room like thunder. Karen sat frozen, staring at the table, her hands trembling. David gathered his papers quietly and turned to leave. As he passed her, she whispered, "You got what you wanted." He stopped, looked at her with calm eyes, and replied, "No. I got what was fair." Then he walked out, leaving behind the ruins of an empire built on greed. Outside, the reporters swarmed him, shouting questions, "Mr. Turner, how does it feel to win? What's next for you?" But he said nothing. He simply walked down the courthouse steps, the cool wind brushing his face. Across the street, the faint outline of the lake shimmered through the fog. The same lake where his cabin once stood. The same water that had watched everything fall and rise again. As he reached his truck, he paused, looked out toward the horizon, and whispered to himself, one inspection at a time. Then he got in, started the engine, and drove back home as the sun broke through the clouds, lighting the lake in gold once more. Weeks passed after the verdict, but Silverpine Lake never forgot what had happened. The air felt cleaner now, the silence calmer, as if the water itself had sighed in relief after years of being watched by the cold eyes of the HOA patrols. The once perfect lawns were growing wild again, and the neighborhood, freed from the constant fear of fines and warnings, was finally breathing. Yet for David Turner, the peace wasn't just around him, it was inside him, slow and steady like the sunrise over the pines. He spent his mornings driving down to the lake, parking by the spot where his cabin had once stood, and just sitting there in the quiet. No construction noise, no orders, no arrogance, just wind, water, and the memory of what was lost. But he didn't sit there in sadness anymore. The empty clearing was no longer a graveyard, it was a promise waiting to be kept. The demolition had taken everything physical, but it hadn't destroyed what the place meant to him. Every plank, every stone, every nail had been placed by his own hands once before, and now, those same hands were ready to build again. The county had cleared his permits in record time, almost as if the whole office had silently agreed that the man who fought the system deserved his home back first. When the approval letter arrived, it was stamped and signed without a single question. Full reconstruction approved, it read in neat print, and for the first time in months, David smiled without reservation. He returned to the lake that same evening, just as the sky began to turn orange and purple. The soft hum of crickets filled the air. He stepped out of his truck, carrying his tool bag, and stood at the edge of the clearing. The soil still bore faint scars from the machines that had torn through it, but it didn't matter. He knelt down, pressed his hand into the earth, and whispered quietly, "We start again." The next few weeks were a blur of work. Day after day, he arrived early, unloading timber, measuring the ground, setting the first stakes for the foundation. Neighbors who once stayed quiet under HOA rule began stopping by, curious and grateful. Some brought coffee, others offered to help. There was no paperwork now, no threats of violation, just people coming together because they finally could. One morning, A family from the other side of the lake arrived. David recognized them. They were the ones fined for having a swing set too close to their fence. The father, a tall man with a gentle smile, carried a bundle of wooden planks on his shoulder. "Heard you're rebuilding," he said. "Figured I'd lend a hand." David nodded, and the two men worked side by side in silence, the rhythm of hammer and saw blending with the rustle of the trees. By noon, more neighbors joined in, a retired carpenter, a couple of teenagers who wanted community service hours, even an elderly woman who baked pies and left them on the hood of his truck. What had once been his private sanctuary was slowly becoming a symbol of unity for everyone the HOA had silenced. Across the lake, the old HOA office sat abandoned, its windows boarded up, its sign removed. Weeds crept through the cracks in the pavement, and the only sound was the wind whistling through broken glass. Occasionally, a passing boat would slow, the driver glancing at the building that had once ruled their lives. Most of them didn't speak of it anymore. It was a bad dream best left in the past. Karen Bixley had vanished after the trial, resigning before the board's official dissolution. Rumor had it she sold her house and moved 2 towns over, though some said she drove by the lake once late at night and sat in her car staring at the water for hours before leaving again. But David didn't care where she went. He wasn't rebuilding to spite her. He was rebuilding to reclaim what she had tried to erase. By the end of summer, the cabin began to rise again. Its frame stood proud against the skyline, the scent of pine and sawdust filling the air. David refused to use modern contractors. Every beam and wall was built the same way it had been years ago, by hand. Each evening, as the sun dipped low, he would sit on the new porch steps, still half-finished, and look out at the lake glowing gold under the setting light. Sometimes, he thought about everything that had happened, the demolition, the humiliation, the endless nights of quiet fury, and yet, none of it felt like bitterness now. It felt like a story that had ended exactly as it should have. He had lost a house, yes, but in return, he had gained something far greater. A community that finally knew what freedom meant. One evening, as he worked on setting the final boards of the dock, a familiar voice called out from behind him. "Never thought I'd see it standing again." David turned and saw Sheriff Mason, the same man who'd responded the day the HOA tore down his cabin. The sheriff stepped closer, his boots crunching over the gravel. "Heard you've been busy." David gave a small smile. "Figured it was time." The sheriff nodded, looking out over the water. "Place looks better than before. Guess justice has a strange way of coming full circle." David glanced toward the reflection of the sky in the lake and said quietly, "It's not about revenge. It's about balance." The sheriff chuckled softly. "Well, whatever you call it, the whole county's talking about this place. Folks are proud of you." David shrugged. "I just did my job." "No," the sheriff said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You reminded people that rules are meant to protect, not control." Then he turned and walked back toward his truck, leaving David standing in the golden light, the sound of the lake lapping softly at the shore. When the cabin was finally complete, it looked almost identical to the one that had been destroyed. The same porch, the same fireplace, the same dock that reached toward the horizon. But there was one new addition, a small bronze plaque mounted beside the door. It read, "Rebuilt under the same laws that tore it down." Beneath it, smaller letters spelled another line, "For every home lost to arrogance, let this one stand as proof that silence can still fight back." On the first night he stayed there, David sat by the fire, the warm glow flickering against the walls. The air outside was cool, the lake quiet. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned back in the old chair he'd repaired from the scraps of the first cabin. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, softly, he murmured, "We're home." Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, whispering through the pines just as it had the night before everything changed. The house creaked softly in the night air, alive again, and for the first time in a long time, David Turner slept in peace. No anger, no bitterness, just the steady rhythm of a man who had fought his battle and won without ever needing to raise his voice. Autumn came early that year, painting the woods around Silver Pine Lake in shades of amber and red, the kind of beauty that only arrives after a storm has passed. The mornings were crisp, the fog rolling in from the water like slow-moving ghosts, and every sound carried farther across the still surface of the lake. David Turner stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, watching the world return to peace. The smell of pine mixed with the faint scent of smoke from his chimney, and in the distance, the laughter of children echoed, a sound that had been missing from this place for years under HOA rule. It was strange, he thought, how silence could mean two different things. Before, it had been the silence of fear and loss. Now, it was the silence of freedom. He walked down to the dock, his boots creaking against the wooden planks that gleamed under the soft morning light. The water reflected the sky like a mirror, broken only by the occasional ripple of a fish breaking the surface. He crouched down, letting his fingers brush the water's edge. This lake had witnessed everything: the arrogance of power, the weight of injustice, the slow, deliberate rise of truth. And now it bore witness to peace. He smiled faintly, feeling the cool breeze on his face, when the sound of tires crunching over gravel reached his ears. Someone was coming. He stood, turning toward the narrow road that wound through the trees. A small silver sedan appeared, slowing as it approached his cabin. The engine went silent, and for a few moments, there was only the sound of the lake and the soft rustle of leaves. Then the door opened, and she stepped out. It was Karen Bixley. She looked nothing like the woman who had once ruled the HOA with an iron smile. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with gray, her face drawn and pale, her confidence stripped away. She wore a simple coat and held nothing but a small envelope in her trembling hands. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind carried a faint chill, scattering a few leaves between them. Finally, Karen broke the silence. "You rebuilt it," she said quietly. Her voice was thin, almost fragile. David nodded once. "Yes." She looked around, her eyes scanning the porch, the dock, the curve of the roofline, all identical to the one she had ordered destroyed. "It looks the same." "It is the same," he said evenly. "Every beam, every stone, rebuilt exactly where it stood. Some things don't need to change, they just need to endure." Karen took a hesitant step closer, her eyes flicking to the plaque by the door. She read the inscription slowly, her lips moving silently, and when she looked back at him, her eyes glistened with something between guilt and sorrow. "I came to apologize," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Not because the court forced me to, not because anyone asked. I just needed to say it." David said nothing, letting her words fall like stones into the quiet air. "I thought I was protecting this place," she continued, her voice breaking. "That I was keeping order. But I was just controlling people. I didn't even see it until it was gone." She swallowed hard and looked down at the envelope in her hands. "This belongs to you." David took a step forward but didn't reach for it yet. "What is it?" he asked calmly. She hesitated. "The last of the HOA records. Bank statements, property lists, everything. I kept copies after the trial. I couldn't bring myself to destroy them." She extended the envelope toward him. "I don't want them anymore. You should have them. Maybe they'll remind someone not to repeat what we did." He looked at her for a long time, then finally reached out and took it. Their hands brushed for a second, and in that small touch, there was no victory or vengeance, only understanding. Karen turned to leave, but David's voice stopped her. "Why come here now?" She froze, her back to him. "Because I needed to see what you built," she said softly. "To see if something good could grow where I left nothing but ashes." He watched as she climbed back into her car, her movements slow, weighed down by everything she'd lost. Before starting the engine, she glanced back one last time, her eyes meeting his across the distance. "You were right that day," she said quietly through the open window. "I had no idea what I'd done." David nodded, his voice steady. "You do now." She gave a faint nod, started the car, and drove away down the dirt road, her figure shrinking into the mist until she disappeared completely. He stood there for a long time after she was gone, the envelope in his hand, the sound of the retreating engine fading into the hum of the forest. Slowly, he walked back to the dock, sat down on the edge, and opened the envelope. Inside were neatly stacked documents, faded receipts, handwritten notes, ghosts of an empire that had once tried to own everything it touched. He stared at them for a while, then closed the envelope and set it beside him. The past didn't need burning. It just needed remembering. As the sun began to set, the lake turned to gold again, the reflection of the cabin shimmering in the rippling water. A few ducks crossed near the far shore, their silhouettes gliding quietly in the evening light. David leaned back, watching the scene unfold, his mind quiet for the first time in what felt like forever. Behind him, the rebuilt cabin stood strong and steady, the smoke from its chimney rising straight into the sky. Everything that had been taken from him had found its way back, not just the land or the walls, but the sense of belonging, the stillness that no law or authority could ever claim. He stayed on the dock until the stars appeared, the night growing deep and cool. Somewhere across the lake, an owl called, its cry echoing softly through the pines. David smiled faintly and whispered into the dark, "It's over now." The words carried across the water, soft but sure, before fading into the still night air. The wind stirred once more, rustling through the trees like an answer, and the lake glimmered under the starlight, holding the memory of everything that had been lost, rebuilt, and finally made right.